Hi, everyone, and welcome. Today we're joined by George Beebe, the former director at the CIA for Russia analysis and the current director of grand strategy at the Quincy Institute. So, welcome back.
Thank you very much.
So, Trump has been warning that he will walk away from the Ukraine talks if progress is not made. And many people argue that this will be the best thing to end the war. As the alternative would be a much slower collapse of Ukraine with more death and destruction, which would also pull the United States further into the war. Now, I tend to be very sympathetic to this argument. However, you published this article now arguing that this would be a huge mistake. So, in your words, it would leave a quote, gaping, festering wound in Europe. Now, I thought a lot about your argument, which I thought was excellent and very convincing. So, I now having second thoughts. So I was wondering if you could, lay out this argument as to why Trump should not walk away from these talks.
Well, let's just imagine a scenario. Let's imagine that Trump says, we're not going to get any kind of a peace deal, any kind of a ceasefire anytime soon. And it's better to cut our losses now, make clear that the United States is no longer going to be involved in this conflict, and put the burden on Russia and Ukraine and potentially Europe to work this out themselves. And they'll do so without the United States involvement in any way. And, if things get worse, that's not our problem, that's theirs. Now, what then flows from that? So let's imagine that the United States truly does cut all its involvement. And that means not just that we're not sending any more weapons to Ukraine for its use in this war, but we're no longer providing intelligence data that the Ukrainians absolutely need if they're going to use precision guided Western weapons on the battlefield against Russia, which won't work without targeting data that only the United States can provide. The Europeans don't have access to that data that can allow the Ukrainians to use these precision guided munitions. So that's a problem for the Ukrainians on the battlefield right away. But also, Starlink, the Elon Musk satellite communications network that we have been providing to the Ukrainians since the start of this invasion, which enables Ukrainian forces on the battlefield to communicate in a more or less secure, more or less unjammable way that they would lose access to. And now they're left having to communicate with one another using means that the Russians could quite likely jam and disrupt and eavesdrop on, which is another significant disadvantage for the Ukrainians on the battlefield. But beyond that, the United States and NATO have been using AWACS patrols. This is airborne air defense surveillance and reconnaissance that depends on aircraft that are flying not in Ukrainian airspace. They're flying over European airspace, but close enough that they can monitor Ukrainian airspace and help direct Ukrainian air defense against incoming missile, bomb, and drone strikes. And if we were to withdraw that, we would be in a situation where the Ukrainians would essentially be quite vulnerable, not just to ground attacks from Russia, but massive missile and bombing strikes against parts of Ukraine that the Russians have really not gone after in a concerted way because of their concerns about escalation into direct war with the United States and NATO, which suddenly would be taken off the table. And we might well be in a situation where you're not seeing a continued, slowly eroding stalemate where the Russians are making incremental advances on the ground, putting pressure on Ukraine's ability to field an effective fighting force over time, but rather a situation where Russia could take advantage of what would otherwise be quite a significant air superiority over Ukraine that could be quite catastrophic for the Ukrainian forces. Now, if we were to do that, and the Russians really went after the Ukrainians in a big way in the air and on the ground, what would the reaction be in the West? Well, I guarantee you that it would not be, oh, well, not our war. This is not Trump's fault. This was Biden's war that he got into. And, Trump tried to fix it, but, it just wasn't fixable. I think the reaction would be, wow, Donald Trump has abandoned our allies in Europe and abandoned our partner in Ukraine. And this is a catastrophe that could have been avoided if Trump had only stayed the course. That is likely to be the political reaction in the West. Now, could Trump, under those circumstances, simply maintain his resolve and say, too bad, not our war, not my war, up to these other guys, they wouldn't come to a compromise, so we're out of there? I don't think so. Now, maybe he could, but I think we would probably be in a situation where politically the pressures on the White House to respond forcefully to that situation would be overwhelming. I don't think politically it's viable to walk away from that circumstance. Now, the other argument you get is that, well, we can pursue improved relations with Russia even if we don't get a peace deal, even if we don't get an end to the fighting in Ukraine. And my reaction to that is, I don't think that's at all politically viable either. Most of Washington is already opposed to détente between the United States and Russia. It's quite evident in the support that you see for Lindsey Graham's bill to impose even tougher economic sanctions on Russia. Quite evident in the response that you see publicly to Ukraine's strikes against Russia's strategic bomber force over the weekend. There is not a lot of desire in Washington for improved U.S.-Russian relations. And I think Trump would have a very difficult time pursuing them politically without an end to the fighting in Ukraine. And on top of that, the very things that would have to be addressed in the U.S.-Russian relationship for that to advance beyond some sort of superficial warmth in relations between the White House and the Kremlin are the very things that are at the heart of the war in Ukraine, namely U.S. support for NATO enlargement, U.S. insistence on westernization of the European security landscape, essentially, at the exclusion of Russia's involvement. These are issues that underlie the war in Ukraine. They're also central to the bilateral U.S.-Russian relationship. And unless you address them, you're not going to get a settlement in Ukraine, and you're also not going to get a fundamental improvement in the U.S.-Russian bilateral relationship.
But often this argument that, well, we do have to help Ukraine, otherwise they will become overwhelmed and overrun by the Russians in this conflict. It's often premised, though, on the idea that this is only a war between Ukraine and Russia, in which, again, Russia has the offensive intentions of conquering as much territory as possible. However, it does seem as if this is primarily a conflict between NATO and Russia, which wasn't resolved, and as a consequence, it was shifted the responsibility over to Ukraine once they had been, promised future NATO membership, and NATO wouldn't move on this topic. So, how do you see this? Because if the nature of the war is a NATO-Russia war, how would not the continued contributions to the war simply then extend, if not escalate, the war between NATO and Russia? Again, you mentioned the attacks on the Russian nuclear forces. This is because this, again, the way they see it from Moscow is this is not merely, Ukraine. This is NATO's attack on Russia's nuclear forces. So now we're looking at yeah, again, a nuclear confrontation over the next few days, possibly between NATO and Russia. So how wouldn't the nature of the war, I guess, impact the analysis here? Or how do you see the nature of the war?
Well, I agree with you. I think there are those in Washington, there are a lot of them that believe this is fundamentally a bilateral conflict between Russia and Ukraine, a war of imperial conquest in which the Russians have decided that territory that Ukraine holds is actually rightfully Russian and should be reclaimed by Russia, and that Ukraine needs essentially to be politically subordinate to Russia, if not a member of the Russian Federation, and that's what this war is fundamentally about. I think that is a misconception of the fundamental dynamic that led to this war in Ukraine. Certainly, there are bilateral aspects to this between Russia and Ukraine, no question about that. But they are under a broader umbrella of a long-term geopolitical tug of war that has been underway between Moscow and Washington since the end of the Cold War. It is a tug of war over the shape of Europe's security architecture, over Russia's place in that architecture, and over Ukraine's place in that architecture. And that means that you can't solve this war by encouraging a bilateral deal between Russia and Ukraine. That only gets you so far. That has to be a part of a settlement, but it is far from sufficient to addressing what Russia calls the root causes of this war. And those root causes lie, I believe, in this bigger geopolitical tug of war that is underway and has been escalating over the course of the last 3 decades. So the United States is directly involved in that bigger geopolitical conflict that is underway. And it can't be resolved without direct American involvement, without direct engagement between Washington and Moscow to address those core geopolitical issues. That's got to be done one way or another. If it is not done, those bigger geopolitical tensions will not just fester, they're likely to escalate. And I think the Ukrainian attacks on the Russian strategic bomber force illustrate why. And if you stop to think about what happened, I think it's profoundly disturbing. The bombers that the Ukrainians attacked were openly displayed on Russian airfields, sitting there exposed for everyone to see from the skies. Why? They were openly displayed because the provisions of the New START Treaty, the Strategic Arms Control Accord between Russia and the United States, mandates that these weapons, these bombers, be openly displayed on airfields so that the other side's satellites can confirm that each side is remaining within compliance of those New START limitations. So the United States does the same thing with our strategic nuclear bombers too. They're openly displayed on American airfields so the Russian side sees that we are remaining within the numerical constraints provided for by that treaty. Now, Ukraine has taken advantage of that open display that is required by US-Russian arms control accords and said, great, we can use the openness, the transparency vital to nuclear stability between the United States and Russia and exploit it and attack one element of Russia's nuclear triad. That's a very dangerous situation, in part because the Russians are quite conscious of what has happened, and they are going to connect dots and say either that the U.S. wanted this to happen, or that we're in a situation where they can't afford to assume otherwise. That the dangers of not responding to this situation very forcefully are such that it would in effect, encourage even more dangerous attacks on Russia's strategic nuclear capabilities. It will reinforce the perceptions of those in the West that believe that Russia is a paper tiger, that it will not follow through on its warnings about red lines, and that we can essentially treat Russia with impunity without fear of escalation and mount even more threatening, even more severe attacks on the Russian homeland and on its nuclear capabilities. That's an extraordinarily dangerous situation. We could be in a situation where Putin's advisors are telling him almost the same thing that Trump's advisors are telling Trump, namely that the other side is talking peace but conducting war, that each side is tapping the other along, and that we can't afford to trust the peaceful intentions that the other side says that it has, and that the only thing that will bring this war to a conclusion is a much tougher approach toward the other side. And if the Russians are thinking that on their side and Americans are thinking that on our side, we could be headed toward a very volatile situation. Now, is it inevitably going to explode in a confrontation between the United States and Russia? I don't think so. But it's one that we can't afford simply to trust won't escalate. I think the United States and Russia are going to have to take active steps, talking directly with one another to diffuse this situation, to put this conflict on a firm path toward a resolution, and to prevent escalation from veering into directions that could be profoundly dangerous.
But I'm not seeing the diffusion though. I see almost in the Western media and among politicians, at least in Europe, almost celebration of this attack on the nuclear forces of Russia. For me, this is quite extraordinary. I mean, and I know your background was, as a director at the CIA, but if you were advising the Kremlin now, no, I'm not saying something put you in a hard spot, but what considerations would be at play? Wouldn't it? Yeah, it would be as you indicated. It's very dangerous not to do something because of the deterrent would fade away and. Would embolden the opponent. Of course, you don't want to go into a nuclear war, but what kind of considerations would be included into advice?
Well, as you, I'm sure, recall, Russia revised its nuclear use doctrine in the past year and explicitly said that attacks by a non-nuclear nation that are conducted with the support of a nuclear state could by themselves be grounds for Russian nuclear use. And they went on to say that if these attacks could disrupt Russia's nuclear capabilities, that would also qualify for nuclear use on Russia's part. So they moved their red lines quite explicitly and quite transparently to account for what looks like exactly this kind of situation, at least from Russia's point of view. I think there's no question that the Russians are going to look at this and say, well, this certainly was directed at our nuclear capabilities. And two, we've got real grounds for suspicion that the Ukrainians may well have done this with the knowledge and support of the United States, a nuclear power. Now, what happens if exactly the situation we warned about in revising our nuclear doctrine was carried out and we do nothing? That could be a very difficult situation for Russia. That failure to respond in some very forceful, very clear way by itself could invite more attacks on Russia. So I think Putin's advisors are going to be telling him exactly that. Now, how does Putin respond to that? I hope his response is, I need to talk to Trump about this because, we could be entering a new phase of this conflict in which Russia is forced to retaliate in a way that in turn might well compel retaliation from the West. And I don't want to walk down that road without talking to the Americans about this situation and having an opportunity to diffuse this. So I don't think a forceful response from Russia is inevitable, but it is certainly a significant possibility. And the implications of that are dangerous enough that I think it's imperative that the two presidents talk about this situation urgently, manage this. And I think it is manageable still, but it could easily get out of hand if we're not each involved in a very direct way in preventing this from escalating any further.
Well, to circle back to the negotiations, though, as you said, if the root cause of this war is the NATO Russia struggle for what the European security architecture should look like, and we're using the Ukrainians as a proxy, how can we how can we explain or justify the format for negotiations? Because negotiations now, the Ukrainians and Russians sitting together, but it seems as if the two main parties who should be negotiating are the Americans and the Russians who should find some settlement. Indeed, the whole idea that NATO expansion, that the Ukrainians have to accept not to join NATO, as opposed to NATO not committing itself to expand. From my perspective, this is part of the reason why what triggered the war to begin with. Because when NATO said we're not going to put any restriction on expansion, then Russia wasn't able to negotiate a new security architecture with the West. So instead, they had to shift its focus on Ukraine to say you can't join this military bloc. And now we have a war. But wouldn't the sensible solution be to shift back towards the great powers, finding a solution for the security architecture?
Yes, I think absolutely. It should not be up to Ukraine to decide whether it joins the NATO alliance or not. The Ukrainians are certainly free to apply. They're certainly free to say we want to join the alliance, but it is up to the United States and other NATO allies to determine whether to accept Ukraine or not. And it does require unanimous NATO consent. So if the United States says, look, not in our interest for Ukraine to be part of the NATO alliance, that is our sovereign right to do so. And we ought to make that decision based not on what is best for Ukraine, but what is best for American national security interests. Yes, I think the United States and Russia have to be negotiating directly with each other over these big geopolitical European security issues. It is not up to the United States and Russia to decide where the border between Ukraine and Russia ought to be drawn. It is not up to the United States to determine for Ukraine, when, where, and how it ought to conduct elections, for example, what its laws ought to say about treatment of Russian language and Russian minorities. Those are issues primarily for Ukraine to determine, and the Russians can certainly attempt to negotiate with the Ukrainians over those issues should they want to. Not up to Washington and Moscow to work out between themselves. But to me, those issues are subsets of this bigger geopolitical conflict that is fundamentally between Moscow and Washington that can't be resolved unless Moscow and Washington negotiate directly with each other. And if we make progress on those bigger issues, it will be that much easier to address all these other issues, that some of which are bilateral matters between Ukraine and Russia.
Because, well, that was part of the problem with the Minsk agreement, the common criticism, because the Minsk agreement was between Kiev and Donbass, and the common argument was, well, it's a bit artificial because it suggests Russia's not party to the conflict, but of course they are party to the conflict, but so is NATO, so we kind of needed to incorporate that complexity within the negotiations, because again, this recognizes Russia as a participant, but not the West. So it's very difficult. I guess the whole yeah, the whole format of this. But another problem though with Trump not walking away from the negotiations is when does this stop? When does this start being Trump's war then? Because there's this very awkward position where Trump once says it's not his war, he's a mediator, but again, the the two main parties, well, if you're not taking into account the Ukrainians, would be the US and Russia. So if this, NATO, but Russia, NATO is really, well, America is the main actor in NATO. So uh, how long can this pretense go on? And if he doesn't walk away, at what point does he own the war?
Well, uh, because American support is so integral to Ukraine's defense, I think if the United States walks away, we own the repercussions of that walking away for Ukraine on the battlefield. And there will be a lot of people in Washington that are going to be very quick to point fingers at Trump in that circumstance. Now, on the other hand, if we don't fully walk away, we continue to provide aid to Ukraine. We continue to provide intelligence support to Ukraine, but don't take an active role in seeking a peaceful settlement of this war. We risk the very situation that we're in right now in the aftermath of the Ukrainian strikes on Russia's strategic bomber force, namely, that the Russians will assume that the United States was involved in some way in Ukraine's carrying out of these strikes. And so, one way or the other, this is going to be a war that Trump can't disavow involvement in. I'm very sympathetic to the notion that Biden deserves an enormous amount of blame for allowing this war to start in the first place. I'm sympathetic to Trump's argument that this is not his war, would not have happened on his watch. But nonetheless, we're in a situation now where I don't think Trump has any viable way of escaping from the repercussions of the decisions that he makes right now about the way forward. And I think of the alternatives, engaging directly with Moscow in seeking a broad geopolitical compromise between the United States and Russia is the best way forward. It would enable and facilitate progress on the whole range of issues that have got to be addressed for a full-fledged peace accord to be agreed and implemented. And you're not going to get there simply by saying, hey, the two sides have to stop shooting at each other. We have to have an unconditional ceasefire first. The Russians won't agree to that because it would sacrifice military leverage that they have on the battlefield right now, which is really their only assurance that they can get the kind of geopolitical bargain with the West that they believe is imperative for their own security interests. So they're not going to give up that leverage. And so I think we need to focus not on insisting that the two sides agree to an immediate ceasefire, but rather that Russia agree to this broad geopolitical compromise. That we say, okay, no Ukraine in NATO, no NATO in Ukraine. And Russia, in turn, makes what would have been an extraordinary concession in 2014, when, as you know, Russia strongly opposed Ukrainian accession to the European Union. And we're now at the point where it looks realistic that Russia would formally agree to support Ukraine's accession into the European Union. In fact, they've said repeatedly that they're willing to do that. So the outlines of that geopolitical bargain are already evident. I think they're within reach. It's something that Trump could achieve if he pushes on that now. And that would be a very significant achievement were he to lock that compromise into place. But it would also enable agreement on a roadmap for addressing all the other technical issues that are going to have to be worked out over time and put a lot less time pressure on that, and help to diffuse what I think is right now a very disturbing situation that is fraught with risks of escalation.
Yeah, so just very brief last question. Do you think you think the negotiations can actually win, that they can be successful? Because it does seem as if the Russians now has locked in this position. We want this neutrality and we want the territorial concessions, and the longer the other side waits, the stricter their demands will be every time they have to come back. And the United States doesn't really have that much leverage over Russia, but if you want to get the two parties so far apart, they would have to put all the pressure on Zelensky and the Europeans. Do you see this? Do you see it the same way? And do you think it's possible to bring them all together on?
Well, um, it should be possible to strike a compromise where Ukraine is not going to be in NATO because the Ukrainians already know they're not going to be in NATO. We've made that abundantly clear. Certainly, it was clear in 2014 when the Russians annexed Crimea and the United States did not go to war to defend Ukraine. It was clear in 2022 when the Russians launched this full scale invasion of Ukraine, and the United States did not go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine. In other words, we've shown by our actions that we are not going to go to war to defend Ukraine. And if we're not going to do that, then we're not going to undertake a treaty obligation to go to war to defend Ukraine, which we would have to do if Ukraine were a part of NATO. So the Ukrainians know that already. Now, what they could get in return for a concession that is not really a concession, but rather an acknowledgement of that fundamental reality, is a path toward independence and sovereignty and future prosperity. In other words, if Ukraine were a part of the European Union, it would be anchored in the West politically and economically in much the way that Austria and Finland were during the Cold War. That worked out very well for them. And it would be something that would offer the prospects of economic reconstruction of Ukraine. It would make it possible for millions of refugees that fled the fighting to return to Ukraine with some hope that they could return to a country that is at peace, that has a real chance of economic reconstruction, and they would have a real chance of jobs and prosperity, etc. So that path toward European Union membership offers hope to Ukraine, which otherwise will not be there. Absent that kind of compromise, the Russians are not going to allow Ukraine to be reconstructed. And they do have a veto over that. And that veto is in the form of missile and bomb strikes, which the West and Ukraine are not in a position to prevent. We simply don't have the air defense capacity to do that. And so what Ukraine would be getting if it were reject this kind of compromise would be putting the country on a path toward dysfunction over time, toward destruction, toward collapse on the battlefield, with no prospect of reconstruction, and grave risks that it would become politically a lot more like Libya than like a prosperous modern European state. And to me, that's a choice that should be a clear one for the Ukrainians and the Europeans to agree to. And I think the Russians can live with it. I think they've indicated that they can live with it. We ought to lock in that kind of concession from the Russians. Once we do, all of the other complications won't be easy to resolve, but they will be a lot more soluble under that set of circumstances than they are right now. So you start big and then work down, rather than starting at the bottom with a ceasefire and hoping that you can build that into that broader geopolitical compromise.
What you're saying is, very sensible, reasonable. My concern is, as I reside in Europe, I'm not seeing this reason at the moment, but that's a topic for another time. So, yes, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciate it.
Good. You're welcome.